This is HOA rejected. It started with snow and ended with a board meltdown. You are out of compliance, and the tow driver is already on his way. That was the first thing I heard before I even registered that someone had kicked my shovel out of my hands. I looked up from the snow pile I had been clearing and saw Amy Martinez standing there in her blue parka, hood up, breath fogging in the freezing air, holding a salt bucket like it was a briefcase full of evidence. She pointed at the storm drain near my driveway and screamed that I was dumping snow into a restricted drainage zone, and that I had exactly 10 minutes to relocate the entire pile or face an immediate lien. I am an auto mechanic. I work early mornings, which means I am out here at 5 in the morning clearing my driveway so I can get to the shop on time. This is Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we do not get snow like this often, but when we do, it shuts everything down fast. The Eastgate HOA sent out an emergency notice 2 days ago saying all homeowners had to clear their driveways and sidewalks within 12 hours of snowfall or face fines. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was in compliance. Amy stepped closer and jabbed her finger toward the storm drain. She said the snow I had pushed to the curb was blocking the drain, and that was a direct violation of Section 12.4 of the Snow Emergency Addendum. I told her I had never heard of Section 12.4. She pulled a folded rule packet in a plastic sleeve from her coat pocket and waved it at me, telling me ignorance was not a defense and that the addendum had been posted on the resident portal 48 hours ago. I asked her if she could show me the exact wording. She said she did not have time to educate me on basic compliance and that the tow truck was already en route to impound my car for obstructing emergency snow routes. I looked at my car. It was parked in my own driveway, behind the snowbank I had just cleared. There was no obstruction. She pointed at the street and said my snow pile extended into the right-of-way, and that made my vehicle non-compliant by proximity. I felt my chest tighten. I had a big contract starting today at the shop, a fleet job that could bring in serious money if I showed up on time and kept the schedule tight. Distractions like this could cost me real money, and Amy knew it. She had been the gate access administrator for Eastgate HOA for 3 years, and in that time she had turned the job into a personal enforcement empire. If you crossed her or questioned her authority, she found a code you were violating and made your life hell until you either paid up or moved out. The tow truck turned the corner. Amy smiled and said I had 2 choices. I could move the snow pile to an approved location, which she would designate after consulting the violation map, or I could let the truck take my car and deal with retrieval fees, plus the fine for the drainage violation. I asked her what an approved location even meant. She said it depended on wind drift patterns and melt runoff zones, and that she would need to inspect my property line before making a determination. I realized she was stalling. She wanted the tow to happen. She wanted me late to work. She wanted me to panic and make a mistake so she could add another violation to the list. I pulled out my phone to film the conversation. She immediately stepped in front of the camera and said recording HOA enforcement actions without written consent was a breach of privacy protocol and that she would add it to my file. I told her this was a public street and I had every right to document what was happening. She said the street might be public, but the HOA had jurisdiction over resident conduct and that my behavior was becoming hostile. The tow driver got out of the truck. He was a big guy in a stained jacket, and he looked annoyed to be out here in the cold. He asked Amy which car he was hooking up. She pointed at mine. He walked over and started inspecting the hitch points. I told him my car was legally parked in my own driveway and that there was no violation. He shrugged and said he had a work order from the HOA and that I needed to take it up with them. I looked at Amy and asked her point blank what this was really about. She smiled and said, "You think this is petty? I think this is my purpose." She said Eastgate was a neighborhood where people followed the rules or they found somewhere else to live, and that I had been flagged as a compliance risk ever since I moved in 6 months ago. I asked her what that meant. She said my work hours were irregular, my truck was often parked in the driveway past the overnight cutoff, and my landscaping had been cited twice for overgrowth during the summer. None of that had anything to do with snow removal, and I told her so. She said it was all part of a pattern and that the board had been watching me. She pulled out her phone and showed me a screen with a time-stamped clip of my truck parked in the driveway at 2 in the morning last month. She said the footage proved I was violating the overnight parking restriction. I told her I worked early mornings, and that the rule allowed overnight parking in your own driveway, as long as the vehicle was not commercial. She said my truck had a toolbox in the bed, and that made it commercial. I felt the frustration building. Every word out of her mouth was a trap. Every rule she cited had a loophole she controlled. The tow driver hooked the chain under my car and started winching it up. I asked him to wait, and told him I would move the snow pile right now if Amy would just tell me where it was supposed to go. Amy said she needed to consult the drainage map, and that it could take up to 72 hours to process my request. 72 hours. The storm was supposed to knock out power tonight, and I needed to get to the shop, finish the fleet job, and secure heat supplies before everything shut down. I did not have 72 hours. I did not even have 72 minutes. I told the tow driver I would pay him to unhook my car right now. He said he could not do that without HOA authorization. I asked him how much the HOA was paying him. He said that was between him and the association. I offered him double. He looked at Amy. She told him if he accepted my bribe, she would report him to the county and have his contract terminated. The driver sighed and kept winching. My phone buzzed. It was my shop foreman asking where I was. I texted back that I was dealing with an HOA situation and that I would be there as soon as I could. He replied that the fleet manager was already on site and asking questions. I felt my stomach drop. I put the phone in my pocket and turned to Amy. I told her I would move the snow right now, wherever she wanted it, and that I would document everything so there was no confusion later. She said documentation would not help me because her enforcement notes were the official record and that my version did not matter. She said, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." That line stuck with me. It was so blatant, so openly corrupt, that I almost laughed. But I did not laugh. I pulled out my phone again and started recording anyway. She stepped closer and said I was escalating the situation and that she was adding insubordination to my file. I asked her what insubordination meant in an HOA context. She said it meant failure to follow lawful instructions from an authorized representative. The tow driver finished winching my car onto the flatbed. He asked Amy where he was taking it. She said the impound lot on the south side, the one that charged $75 a day storage. I asked her how I was supposed to get to work. She said that was not her problem and that I should have thought about that before I violated the snow emergency protocol. My phone battery was already at 30%, and the cold was draining it fast. I knew if it died, I would lose my only way to document what was happening. I tried to text the foreman again, but the message failed to send. The signal was terrible in the snow. I looked up and saw the tow truck pulling away with my car on the back. Amy handed me a violation notice. It was printed on HOA letterhead with my address and a list of offenses. Snow dumping in a restricted drainage zone. Overnight parking in a commercial vehicle. Failure to comply with emergency directives. Total fines, $850, due within 10 business days or subject to lien placement. I stared at the paper. I had been out here for less than 20 minutes, and I was already buried under fines I did not understand, and could not dispute without paperwork I did not have. I asked Amy how I was supposed to pay fines I had not even been warned about. She said the emergency addendum was the warning, and that all residents were responsible for checking the portal daily. I told her I checked the portal 2 days ago, and there was no mention of drainage zones. She said the addendum was posted at 11 at night, and that the 12-hour compliance window started immediately. I did the math. That meant I had until 11 this morning to clear the snow, which I was doing when she showed up. She said my method of clearing was non-compliant, and that intent did not matter. I asked her for a copy of the drainage zone map. She said maps were available for review at the HOA office during business hours, which were 10 to 3 on weekdays. I told her it was 5:30 in the morning, and that I needed to see the map now so I could fix whatever she thought was wrong. She said I could file a records request, and that the processing fee was $25, payable in advance, with a 30-day turnaround. 30 days. For a map. To fix a problem she was fining me for right now. I realized this was not about compliance. This was about control. She was using the snow emergency as cover to squeeze me for money and force me out of the neighborhood. I had seen her do it to other people. There was a guy 2 streets over who got hit with a landscaping violation every week until he sold his house and moved. There was a couple near the clubhouse who got fined for trash bin placement so many times they just gave up and started paying without arguing. Eastgate was a neighborhood where deadlines changed depending on who was being targeted, and I was the current target. I asked Amy why. I asked her what I had done to make her hate me this much. She said hate had nothing to do with it, and that she was simply enforcing the governing documents. She said if I had a problem with the rules, I could attend the next board meeting and voice my concerns during the public comment period. I asked her when the next meeting was. She said it was 3 weeks from now, and that I needed to submit a written request to speak at least 10 days in advance. 3 weeks. 10 days notice. By then, I would already be buried in fines and facing a lien. I watched her walk back to her car. She had a tiny body camera clipped to her coat, just above the pocket where she kept the rule packet. I had noticed it before, but never thought much about it. Now I realized she was recording everything, building a file, creating a paper trail that would make me look like the problem no matter what I said or did. But here is the thing about body cameras. They record everything, including the things you do not want recorded. I stood there in the snow, freezing, broke, late for work, and staring at a violation notice that made no sense. I did not have my car. I did not have a way to fight this without missing the contract that could save my month. I did not even have a working phone anymore because the battery finally died. But I had something Amy did not know about. I had been documenting everything since the first time she came after me in the summer. Every email, every notice, every interaction. I had timestamps, screenshots, and a folder full of contradictions where the HOA said one thing in writing and did something completely different in practice. And I had just remembered something important. 3 weeks ago, I sent the HOA a certified letter with proof that I had moved my snow-clearing equipment to the garage and that my truck no longer had a toolbox in the bed. I sent it with tracking, and I had the receipt showing they signed for it on a Tuesday morning. The violation notice Amy just handed me was dated 2 days after that delivery, and it still listed the truck as commercial. I stared at the violation letter and smiled, because it proved exactly what I suspected. They were not enforcing rules, they were making things up as they went, and they were counting on people being too tired or too broke to fight back. I walked inside and plugged in my phone. While it charged, I dug through my files and found the certified mail receipt. I found the original letter. I found the email thread where the HOA management company confirmed they received my compliance proof and said my file was updated. I found the response from Amy herself, sent from her HOA email, saying the truck issue was resolved and that no further action was required. And then I found the fine notice, dated 2 days later, citing the exact same truck violation she said was resolved. I took pictures of everything. I uploaded them to a cloud folder. I emailed copies to myself and to a buddy of mine who had dealt with HOA issues in another neighborhood. Then I called a contractor I knew, a guy named Marcus, who refused to be bullied and who had worked in Eastgate before. I told him what was happening. He said he was not surprised and that Amy had tried the same thing on him last year when he was doing a roof job for someone on the north end. Marcus said Amy had threatened to revoke his vendor access unless he kicked back 10% of his fees to a discretionary fund she controlled. He said no, she reported him for code violations, and he ended up having to fight the county for 3 months to clear his name. He said he had emails proving the shakedown attempt, but the HOA board refused to look at them and told him it was a he said, she said situation. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare and want to see how I turn it around, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the little guy wins. I asked Marcus if he would be willing to show up at the next board meeting and testify. He said he would do better than that. He said he would write a statement, bring his emails, and stand there in person so they could not ignore him. I thanked him and told him I owed him one. He said I did not owe him anything and that someone needed to stop Amy before she ran the whole neighborhood into the ground. I called the impound lot and asked how much it would cost to get my car back. They said $75 for the tow, $75 for the first day storage, and another $50 for the administrative release fee. $200 just to get my car back, and I still had not dealt with the $850 in fines. I called my foreman and told him I was not going to make it in time for the fleet job. He said the manager was pissed and that he could not hold the contract open past noon. I told him I understood and that I would get there as soon as I could. He hung up without saying anything else. I knew I had just lost the job. I sat there for a minute, trying to figure out my next move. I could pay the impound fee and get my car back, but that would not stop the fines or the lien threat. I could ignore the fines and let the HOA take me to collections, but that would wreck my credit and make it impossible to refinance or sell. I could fight it, but fighting meant time and money I did not have, and the HOA knew it. Then my phone buzzed. It was a group chat message from someone in the neighborhood. The message said Amy had just posted an emergency bulletin on the resident portal, saying the snow removal deadline had been moved up to 9 this morning, and that anyone still in violation after that would face immediate towing and fines doubled. I checked the timestamp. The bulletin was posted 15 minutes ago, which was after she had already towed my car and handed me a violation notice. She was changing the rules in real time and using the emergency protocol to cover her tracks. I screenshotted the bulletin and added it to my evidence folder. Then I checked the group chat history. There were dozens of messages from other residents complaining about the same thing. Deadline changes with no notice. Fines for violations that were not in the governing documents. Towing threats over minor issues that could have been fixed with a phone call. One person said they tried to file a complaint with the management company and were told that Amy was acting within her authority and that the board supported her enforcement actions. Another person said they hired a lawyer, and the lawyer told them it would cost more to fight the HOA than to just pay the fines and move on. I started replying to the group chat, asking if anyone had documentation of the deadline changes or the contradictory notices. 3 people responded within minutes. One person sent a PDF of a violation notice that cited a rule that did not exist in the governing documents. Another person sent an email chain where Amy promised to waive a fine and then doubled it 2 days later. A third person sent photos of a meeting where Amy told residents one thing and then sent a follow-up email saying the exact opposite. I realized I was not alone. I realized there were other people who had been burned by the same tactics, and they were all sitting on evidence but did not know what to do with it. I created a shared folder and invited everyone in the group chat to upload their documentation. Within an hour, I had 23 files, violation notices with conflicting dates, emails where Amy promised compliance and then fined people anyway, photos of Amy yelling at residents during enforcement actions, recordings of board meetings where she interrupted people and shut down complaints. And buried in the middle of the folder was a bombshell. Someone had uploaded a video from last month showing Amy at a board meeting, arguing with the HOA attorney about whether her enforcement actions were legal. The attorney told her she was overstepping her authority and that the board needed to rein her in before someone filed a lawsuit. Amy told the attorney he was being dramatic and that no one would sue because no one could afford it. The video cut off, but the uploader added a note saying the attorney quit 2 weeks later and that the board never replaced him. I downloaded everything and started organizing it into a timeline. I had proof that Amy was issuing fines based on rules that did not exist. I had proof that she was changing deadlines after the fact to justify enforcement actions. I had proof that she was threatening vendors and residents to maintain control, and I had proof that the board knew about it and did nothing. But I still needed one more thing. I needed proof that they received my compliance documents and fined me anyway. I needed proof that this was not incompetence, but intentional retaliation. I went back through my certified mail receipts and found the tracking number for the letter I sent 3 weeks ago. I pulled up the Postal Service website and saw that the letter was signed for by someone named Janet, who worked in the HOA management office. I called the management company and asked to speak to Janet. The receptionist said Janet no longer worked there. I asked when she left. The receptionist said she could not give out that information. I asked to speak to the manager. The receptionist put me on hold for 10 minutes, then came back and said the manager was unavailable, and that I needed to submit my questions in writing. I told her I already submitted everything in writing, and that I was being fined for violations that were resolved. She said she could not discuss individual cases, and that I needed to work with the board. I hung up and called the impound lot again. I told them I would be there in an hour to pick up my car. They said I needed to bring cash or a money order because they did not take cards. I asked them if I could pay over the phone. They said no. I did not have cash. I did not have time to get to a bank. I called Marcus and asked if he could give me a ride to the impound lot. He said he could, but he was on a job and would not be free until noon. I told him that was fine, and that I would meet him at his site. While I waited, I started drafting an email to every homeowner in Eastgate. I laid out everything I had found. I attached the timeline. I included links to the shared folder. I explained that Amy was running a compliance scam and that the board was either complicit or incompetent, and either way we needed to force a change. I hit send at 8 in the morning. By 8:30, my inbox was flooded with replies. Some people thanked me. Some people said they had been thinking the same thing but were too scared to speak up. Some people said I was making trouble and that I should just pay the fine and move on. One person said I was going to get sued for defamation. I replied that truth is a defense and that I had documentation for every claim I made. By 9, the group chat exploded. People were sharing the email, adding their own stories, tagging neighbors who were not in the chat. Someone said they were going to print copies and hand them out at the clubhouse. Someone else said they were going to forward it to a local news reporter who covered HOA issues. Then my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a man introduced himself as Paul, a homeowner on the west side who had been fighting Amy for 2 years. He said he saw my email and wanted to help. He said he had access to the HOA financial records because he was on the audit committee, and he had found discrepancies in the fine collection process. I asked him what kind of discrepancies. He said Amy had been collecting fines in cash from certain residents and issuing handwritten receipts that were never entered into the official ledger. He said the amounts did not match up, and when he brought it to the board, they told him he was overstepping his role and that financial audits were the treasurer's responsibility. I asked him if he had proof. He said he had spreadsheets, receipts, and emails where he flagged the issue and was ignored. He said he was willing to present everything at the next board meeting if I could organize a group of residents to back him up. I told him I could, and I told him about Marcus and the vendor blacklist issue. Paul said he knew about that too, and that there were at least 3 other contractors who had been pushed out of the neighborhood for refusing to pay Amy's unofficial fees. We agreed to meet at the clubhouse later that day to go over everything. Paul said he would bring his files, and I said I would bring mine. He said we needed to be careful, because Amy had allies on the board, and they would try to shut us down before we could make the case. Marcus picked me up at noon. We drove to the impound lot in silence. I paid the fees in cash, got my car back, and followed Marcus to a diner near the shop. We sat in a booth, and I showed him everything I had collected. He read through the timeline, looked at the photos, watched the board meeting video. When he was done, he said, "She is going to fight this hard. She is going to say you are lying, that the documents are fake, that you are a disgruntled resident with an agenda. You need to be ready for that." I told him I was ready. I told him I had been ready since the moment she kicked my shovel aside and smiled while my car got towed. Marcus nodded and said he would be there at the meeting, and that he would bring 2 other contractors who had similar stories. The board meeting was scheduled for 7 that night at the clubhouse. I spent the afternoon organizing my evidence into a presentation. I printed copies of every document. I loaded the videos onto a thumb drive. I wrote a 3-page statement that laid out the case step by step. At 6:30, I drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was already full. There were at least 40 people inside, way more than the usual turnout. The board president, a retired guy named Tom, looked nervous. The treasurer looked confused. Amy sat in the front row, with her arms crossed, glaring at everyone who walked in. Paul was already there with his files. Marcus showed up with 2 other contractors. A woman I did not know introduced herself as Karen's neighbor and said she had been fined 6 times in the last year and was ready to testify. Tom called the meeting to order and said we would follow the normal agenda, which meant public comment would come last. Someone in the crowd shouted that public comment needed to come first because half the people in the room were there to talk about enforcement abuse. Tom said the bylaws required the agenda to be followed in order. Amy stood up and said if anyone had concerns they could file a written complaint, and the board would review it at the next meeting. Someone shouted that the next meeting was 3 weeks away, and that people were being fined right now. Amy said that was how the process worked, and that anyone who did not like it could move. That was when Paul stood up and said he had financial records that showed cash fines being collected off the books. The room went silent. Tom asked Paul to sit down and wait for public comment. Paul said this could not wait, and that the board needed to see the records immediately. Amy stood up and said Paul was violating meeting decorum, and that his audit committee access had been revoked for insubordination. Paul asked when his access was revoked. Amy said it was revoked that morning by emergency board action. Paul said there was no record of an emergency board action, and that she was lying. Tom tried to regain control. He said everyone needed to calm down, and that we would get to public comment in due time. I stood up and said I had proof that the HOA was issuing fines based on rules that did not exist, and that residents were being targeted for retaliation. I said I had emails, certified mail receipts, and board meeting recordings that proved the enforcement system was corrupt. Amy turned to me and said I was out of order and that I would be removed if I did not sit down. I said I had every right to speak and that I was not going to sit down until the board addressed the evidence. She pulled out her phone and said she was calling security. Someone in the crowd yelled that there was no security and that she was bluffing. Then Marcus stood up and said Amy had tried to extort him for vendor fees and that he had emails proving it. He said she threatened to blacklist him if he did not pay, and that when he refused she filed false code violations against him. He said 2 other contractors in the room had the same experience, and that they were all willing to testify under oath. Amy said Marcus was lying, and that he had been banned from the neighborhood for shoddy work. Marcus pulled out his phone and played a voicemail from Amy where she said, "If you want to keep working in Eastgate, you will need to contribute to the Community Improvement Fund." The room erupted. People were shouting. Tom was banging a gavel. Amy was yelling that the voicemail was taken out of context. I walked to the front of the room and handed Tom a folder with every piece of evidence I had collected. I said, "This is a certified mail trail proving the HOA received my compliance proof and fined me anyway." I said, "This is an email chain from the management company admitting the notice date was wrong." I said, "This is a timeline showing that Amy changed enforcement deadlines after the fact to justify towing and fines." Tom opened the folder and started reading. His face went pale. The treasurer leaned over and read with him. Amy tried to grab the folder, but Tom pulled it away. She said the documents were forgeries, and that I had no right to present them without advance notice. I said I sent an email to every homeowner that morning, with links to everything, and that the board could verify the authenticity of every document by checking their own records. Paul stood up again and said, "I have financial records showing cash fines collected off the books. I have receipts that were never entered into the ledger. I have emails where I flagged these discrepancies and was told to drop it." He handed his folder to Tom. Tom set it on the table without opening it and said he needed to consult with the board attorney before proceeding. Someone in the crowd shouted that the board did not have an attorney anymore because he quit after Amy ignored his advice. Tom said that was not accurate and that the attorney was on retainer. Paul said, "Call him right now and ask him if he is still representing the board." Tom pulled out his phone and made a call. He put it on speaker. A man answered, and Tom asked if he was still the HOA attorney. The man said no, that he resigned last month because the board refused to address the enforcement issues he flagged. He said he told them Amy was opening the HOA up to liability, and that someone was going to sue. He said he could not be part of it anymore. Tom ended the call. The room was silent. Amy stood up and said the attorney quit because he was incompetent, and that the board was in the process of hiring new counsel. Paul said, "You have been saying that for a month, and you have not hired anyone, because no attorney will touch this after they see the records." Then something unexpected happened. The treasurer stood up and said she was done. She said she joined the board to help the neighborhood, not to cover up fraud. She said she had been asking questions about the fine collection process for weeks, and had been stonewalled by Amy and the board president. She said if the board did not address this immediately, she was resigning and filing a complaint with the county. Tom tried to calm her down. She said she was calm, and that she was also serious. She said the board had a choice: investigate the enforcement abuse and financial discrepancies, or watch the whole association collapse under the weight of lawsuits and bad press. Amy said the treasurer was being manipulated by disgruntled residents and that the board needed to stay strong. The treasurer said, "I am not being manipulated. I am looking at the same evidence everyone else is looking at, and it is damning." Tom finally said he was calling for an emergency executive session to review the evidence. Amy said that was not necessary, and that the board could address the complaints at the next regular meeting. Tom said no, that the situation was too serious to wait, and that the board needed to make a decision tonight. Someone in the crowd said the executive session needed to be open to the public. Tom said executive sessions were confidential by law. Paul said, "Then we will wait right here until you come out and tell us what you decided." Tom and the treasurer left the room. Amy stayed behind, glaring at everyone. Marcus walked over to her and said, "You tried to ruin me. You tried to ruin all of us. And now everyone knows what you are." Amy said nothing. She just sat there, holding her phone, her body camera still recording. 20 minutes later, Tom and the treasurer came back. Tom said the board had reviewed the evidence and concluded that there were serious concerns about the enforcement process and the financial records. He said the board was suspending all pending fines pending an independent audit, and that Amy was being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Amy stood up and said the board did not have the authority to do that. Tom said the board had every authority under the governing documents to investigate misconduct and take corrective action. Amy said she was not going anywhere, and that the board would regret this. Then Tom said something that stunned the room. He said the board had contacted the HOA insurance carrier that afternoon after receiving my email, and that the carrier had issued a non-renewal warning. He said the carrier demanded reforms within 10 days or the association would lose coverage, and that the board could not ignore the evidence any longer because the entire neighborhood could lose insurance. Amy went pale. She said the insurance threat was a bluff. Tom said it was not, and that he had the email to prove it. He said the carrier had been monitoring the group chat and the complaint emails, and that they viewed the enforcement practices as a liability risk. Paul stood up and said, "What about the financial discrepancies?" Tom said the board was hiring a forensic accountant to review the cash fine records, and that anyone who had paid fines in cash would be contacted for verification. He said if the audit found evidence of theft, the board would refer the matter to law enforcement. Amy grabbed her bag and walked toward the door. Someone shouted, "Where are you going?" She did not answer. She just kept walking. When she reached the door, her phone rang. She answered it and said, "I am not dealing with this right now," and hung up. Then her phone rang again. She looked at the screen, turned it off, and left. The room erupted in applause. Marcus shook my hand. Paul clapped me on the back. The treasurer came over and thanked me for organizing the evidence. She said, "You did not just save yourself, you saved the whole neighborhood." Over the next week, things moved fast. The forensic accountant confirmed that Amy had been collecting fines in cash and issuing handwritten receipts that were never entered into the official ledger. The total discrepancy was over $12,000. The board voted to refer the matter to the district attorney, and Amy was charged with theft and fraud. The HOA hired a new management company and implemented a new enforcement protocol that required all fines to be approved by the board and documented in writing with a clear appeals process. The board also voided every fine issued under Amy's authority and refunded everyone who had paid. I got a written reversal from management with a real citation clearing my record. My car was never towed again. My snow pile was never questioned again. Amy tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. The body camera she wore during enforcement actions had recorded dozens of interactions where she threatened residents, changed deadlines on the spot, and admitted to collecting fines off the books. Her own device became the smoking gun. In the end, she pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and was banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. The board removed the enforcement action and voided the ledger entry for everyone she had targeted. Marcus got his vendor access restored and landed 3 new contracts in the neighborhood. Paul was elected to the board and became the new compliance chair. The treasurer stayed on and worked with the new management company to overhaul the financial reporting system. As for me, I kept my job at the shop and finished the fleet contract a week later than planned, but the client understood and gave me another job to make up for it. I still live in Eastgate, and the neighborhood is quieter now. People are not afraid to ask questions or challenge decisions. The rules are still enforced, but fairly, and with transparency. And every time I clear my driveway in the winter, I think about that morning when Amy kicked my shovel aside and told me the tow truck was on its way. I think about how close I came to just paying the fine and moving on. I think about how many other people did exactly that and never got justice. But I also think about the moment when her phone died mid-rant and she froze in place, staring at the screen realizing she had lost control. I think about the moment when the board told her she was on leave and she walked out of that meeting knowing everyone saw it. I think about the moment when the forensic accountant handed the board a report that proved everything I had been saying. And I think about how one person standing up can change everything, as long as you have the receipts to back it up. I hope your property line stays drama-free.